On the 27th of July, 2025, the world froze. A soldier who once rose through the smoke of a coup now stands among nominees for the highest honor of peace. Ibrahim Traoré, only 36 years old, leader of Burkina Faso, is not the diplomat the world expected. He is not a laureate polished by treaties and banquets. He is the face of defiance, of survival, of a nation that refused to collapse. This is not charity. This is not pity. This is sovereignty. The announcement in Oslo sent shockwaves across continents. In Ouagadougou, flags were raised, chants filled Revolution Square. For once, Burkina Faso was not defined by headlines of insurgency, but by recognition on the world stage. And yet in Western capitals, brows furrowed. How can a man who seized power with rifles be hailed as a cultivator of peace? That is the question history now asks of us. To answer it, we must walk through dust-laden battlefields, through farms reborn from ashes, through the voices of those who call him not a usurper, but a defender. Stay with us. What follows is more than news. It is the measure of Africa's dignity. Subscribe and keep watching. The road to Oslo did not begin in the marble halls of diplomacy. It began in the dust of the Sahel, in the villages of Burkina Faso, where fear had become a daily companion. By 2022, the nation stood on the brink of collapse. Insurgent groups had seized vast stretches of countryside. Thousands of families abandoned their homes, and the state appeared paralyzed, crippled by corruption and dependency on foreign powers. The soil of the nation was cracked, waiting for rain, for a seed of change. That seed came on the 30th of September, 2022. Ibrahim Traoré, then a relatively unknown army captain, marched into Ouagadougou. In one decisive stroke, the old regime fell. To the outside world, it was another coup in West Africa, one more entry in the catalog of instability. Headlines from Paris and Washington predicted a downward spiral, a descent into chaos. Yet within Burkina Faso, the story carried a different rhythm. To citizens long suffocated by silence, Traoré's move was not just a seizure of power. It was a proclamation. The old order had ended. At only 34 years of age, Traoré became the world's youngest head of state. But unlike many who ascend by force, he refused the image of a ruler enthroned above his people. Instead, he styled himself as a caretaker, a custodian of the nation's battered dignity. His speeches were not laced with diplomatic jargon. They were blunt, spoken in the language of farmers and soldiers alike. "I am not here for power," he declared to a rally in Ouagadougou. "I am here to defend this land and its children." Those words cut through decades of disappointment. For too long, leaders had bowed to external dictates, offering promises but delivering little security. Traoré's stance resonated because it was rooted in defiance. Within weeks, he expelled French troops who had operated in Burkina Faso for years, arguing their presence had not halted insurgent advance. He instead turned to neighboring Mali and Niger, forging the alliance of Sahel states, a pact of regional solidarity against shared threats. This was more than geopolitics. To many Burkinabé, it was pride restored, proof that their young leader was willing to break with dependency in pursuit of sovereignty. Yet sovereignty alone does not confer legitimacy. The true test lay in how he carried himself. Rather than retreating into palaces, Traoré traveled to the provinces. He stood among displaced villagers, spoke in marketplaces, and visited soldiers at the front. His attire was simple, his presence direct. In a nation weary of suits and protocols, this style mattered. It suggested not just a ruler, but a comrade who walked the same roads of hardship. By the end of 2023, skeptics inside the country began to concede. Traoré was more than a transitional officer. His words of sovereignty were not empty slogans. They were shaping a new imagination of leadership. He spoke of governance as a battle on multiple fronts: security, education, agriculture, dignity. For him, politics was not about handshakes abroad, but survival at home. Still, outside observers remain doubtful. To many, he was simply another coup-maker destined to fade into irrelevance. The world had not yet seen the evidence that would shift perception. But Burkina Faso was moving step by step towards a bold experiment that would shake this judgment. The stage was being set. The soil was waiting. A question lingered like a storm on the horizon. Could a nation born of rifles plant the seeds of peace? But how does a soldier's coup turn into a farmer's peace? Peace is never an abstract word. It is measured in footsteps returning to villages, in classrooms filled once again with children, in harvests brought home without fear of gunfire. The Farmers of Peace initiative did more than silence rifles. It began to rebuild the very fabric of society. By late 2025, reports from Burkina Faso told a story of quiet transformation. Families who had fled the countryside were returning to their homes. Markets that had once been deserted were alive with trade. Teachers who had abandoned posts in dangerous zones reopened classrooms, and laughter echoed once more through schoolyards. For ordinary Burkinabe, this was not a theory debated in Oslo. It was daily life reclaimed. Politically, the impact was profound. Ibrahim Traoré had entered power as a soldier, a figure mistrusted by international observers. Yet his ability to connect military authority with civilian recovery altered perceptions. He was no longer seen merely as the man who seized control. He was regarded increasingly as the leader who restored a measure of dignity. For the first time in years, the national conversation was not dominated by dependency on foreign donors, but by local initiative. Sovereignty was no longer a slogan. It was an experience lived in the villages and towns. This shift carried deep consequences for governance. Burkinabe citizens, long skeptical of politics, began to engage again. Local leaders, elders, and farmers' associations found themselves in dialogue with the state. The fragile trust between government and people, once severed, was beginning to mend. It was as though a bridge, long broken, was being rebuilt, one plank at a time. Economically, the program tied peace directly to productivity. Each former militant who laid down a rifle and took up a hoe contributed to the nation's survival. Agriculture, already the backbone of Burkina Faso, became more than an economic sector. It became a weapon against instability. More hectares were cultivated, more families fed, more reliance on imports reduced. In a country where hunger often fueled recruitment into armed groups, the simple act of tilling soil became an act of security. For many citizens, this was the first time they felt their government acted not as a distant administrator, but as a partner in survival. Traoré's travels to rural provinces reinforced this perception. He was not a president locked in marble palaces. He was a leader who shook hands with farmers, who listened to widows, who addressed soldiers and villagers alike with the same blunt words. His leadership model was not based on spectacle, but on presence. The political order was also being reshaped. The old paradigm of reliance on Western troops and aid was replaced by a narrative of self-determination. The decision to expel French forces, controversial abroad, now seemed vindicated at home. Citizens pointed to tangible improvements and asked why dependency had been tolerated for so long. It was as if the nation had collectively exhaled, relieved to be charting its own course, however uncertain. Yet fragility remained. Critics warned that reconciliation through farming, while impressive, could not substitute for long-term political reforms. International organizations reminded observers that Burkina Faso still operated under a military transition. The balance between sovereignty and democratic accountability was unresolved. These tensions raised uncomfortable questions. Could Traoré's legitimacy endure once elections returned? Would the fragile calm survive shifts in power? Despite the doubts, the immediate civil and political effects were undeniable. Where once despair reigned, cautious hope now took root. Where once silence spoke of fear, voices returned to public life. For many, This transformation mattered more than debates in foreign capitals. It was the difference between fleeing and staying, between hunger and harvest. And so, Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier once dismissed as a coup maker, became something else, a nation builder. His story was no longer only about seizing power, but about stitching together a torn social fabric. His leadership had entered the lives of his people not through decrees alone, but through the soil under their feet. The case of Ibrahim Traoré demonstrates how sovereignty, when tied to daily survival, can redefine both politics and peace in Africa. But could this fragile calm survive under the gaze of the world's great powers? No story of peace exists in isolation. As Burkina Faso's experiment unfolded, the world watched, questioned, and debated. The reactions revealed not only attitudes toward Ibrahim Traoré, but also the deeper fractures of the global order. Within Africa, responses were marked by solidarity. The African Union issued statements cautiously welcoming local solutions, praising the decline in violence while reminding that constitutional order remained essential. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders saw Traoré's defiance of Western dependency as a mirror of their own struggles. Commentators spoke of a Sahelian renaissance, a rebirth of African agency, where nations no longer waited for permission to act, but crafted their own definitions of peace. In West Africa's regional bloc, ECOWAS, the tone was more conflicted. On one hand, its charter condemns military takeovers. On the other, the tangible results of Farmers of Peace were difficult to dismiss. Debates within ECOWAS councils revealed the dilemma. Should principles of democracy override recognition of grassroots stability? Beyond Africa, Europe, and the United States struggled with similar contradictions. In Paris and Washington, editorials warned that Oslo might legitimize military coups if it rewarded Traoré. Yet even within those criticisms, there was an admission. His policies had achieved something foreign troops and expensive missions had not. In London, analysts asked whether Western frameworks of peace, conferences, treaties, missions were too narrow for today's realities. At the United Nations, discussions about Burkina Faso shifted tone. Where once the agenda focused on humanitarian aid and security interventions, delegates began to ask whether grassroots reintegration models should be studied and adapted elsewhere. Quietly, the international system was acknowledging that innovation did not always come from Geneva or New York, but from Ouagadougou's fields. Then came the moral weight of the Vatican. Pope Leo XIV's declaration praising the transformation of warriors into farmers resonated across continents. It reframed Traoré's story not merely as political but spiritual, a fulfillment of the ancient prophecy of swords into plowshares. Few leaders from the Sahel had ever received such an endorsement. The effect was to elevate the debate from pragmatic policy into the realm of universal ethics. Yet controversy lingered. Critics reminded the world of fragile governance, of risks still haunting Burkina Faso. They pointed to assassination attempts and whispered of instability, tentative d'assassinat, Ibrahim Traoré, as evidence that peace remained contested, fragile, incomplete. And so the question returned to Oslo. Could the Nobel Committee recognize a peace grown in African soil with the same seriousness as peace negotiated in European halls? Would Oslo dare to crown a soldier-turned-farmer with the highest peace honor? The story does not end with a nomination. It stretches forward into an uncertain road where triumph and peril walk side by side. For Burkina Faso and for Africa, the future hangs in the balance. As the 10th of December, 2025 approaches, the day Oslo will announce its laureate, the stakes rise higher. If Ibrahim Traoré were to win, it would mark the first time a sitting African head of state received the Nobel Peace Prize. For his people, it would be a continental victory, proof that Africa's models of reconciliation can command respect on the world stage. Murals already painted on walls in Ouagadougou would not simply honor a leader, they would symbolize a new chapter of dignity for a land long spoken of only in terms of poverty or conflict. Yet the path ahead is far from certain. Even if he wins, the weight of expectation could be immense. A Nobel would not silence insurgents overnight, nor resolve the tensions between military rule and democratic aspirations. It could bring both pride and pressure, drawing greater scrutiny from allies and critics alike. Should he lose, the nomination itself remains a milestone, a signal that Africa's voice can no longer be ignored. The deeper challenge lies beyond the prize. It lies in sustaining peace in the soil. Programs like Farmers of Peace require resources, patience, and protection against relapse. Former fighters must find not only land to cultivate, but also dignity to preserve. Communities must continue to weave fragile threads of trust. Leaders must guard against the temptation to wield sovereignty as isolation rather than partnership. Still, the possibilities remain inspiring. If Burkina Faso, landlocked and scarred by years of insurgency, can turn conflict into cultivation, then the Sahel itself may yet find a harvest of hope. And if the Sahel can, then why not Africa at large? The future may hold risks, but it also holds the possibility of a new dawn, one where peace is not an import from foreign capitals, but a crop sown by African hands. This is the paradox and the promise. The road ahead is uncertain, yet it carries the potential to reshape global imagination. What is at stake is more than a prize in Oslo. It is the right of a continent to define peace in its own image. But in the end, the verdict may not come from Oslo at all. It may come from the fields of Burkina Faso, where people already walk their land in fragile but real peace. From the dust of September 2022 to the nomination of July 2025, the journey of Burkina Faso tells us something profound. A young captain who once marched with rifles has become the face of a new imagination of peace. Ibrahim Traoré rose not by echoing the words of foreign capitals, but by anchoring his nation's survival in sovereignty and soil. The Farmers of Peace initiative was more than a policy. It was a parable. It showed that reconciliation could sprout not from marble conference tables, but from furrowed fields where former enemies now sow side by side. It linked the dignity of labor with the fragile calm of villages once silenced by fear. For many in Burkina Faso, this was already victory: the right to hope, the right to return, the right to belong. The world, however, is still deciding. In Oslo, the Nobel Committee weighs not only a candidacy, but a definition. Will peace continue to mean signatures and treaties, or can it also mean seeds and harvests? Will a continent long treated as a battlefield finally be recognized as a producer of its own solutions? The outcome remains uncertain, but the question itself marks a turning point. This is why the story of Ibrahim Traoré matters. It is not only about one man. It is about Africa's right to dignity, about a continent's struggle to claim its place in the global narrative of peace. Even whispers of tentative d'assassinat, Ibrahim Traoré remind us that the path forward is fragile, contested, yet alive. The very fragility proves the stakes. Peace is not a trophy. It is a daily harvest. So we end where we began, with a paradox. Yes, a soldier can plant peace. Yes, a coup can give way to cultivation. And yes, Africa can stand not as a recipient of pity, but as a partner in shaping tomorrow. The world waits for Oslo's verdict. But perhaps the more important judgment has already been rendered by the people of Burkina Faso themselves. Their calm, however fragile, speaks louder than decrees. Their fields, once stained by fire, now whisper of possibility. If this story resonates with your sense of justice, do not walk away. Share it, add your voice in the comments, and subscribe to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's future.